Hello and welcome. Today I have a game that features two of the great chess players from the past, including the third world chess champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, and he'll be facing Richard Reti, who has the black pieces. Now, just remember, Capablanca has the white pieces and Reti has the black pieces, because when I do this analysis here, for some reason it erased their names. So we see that Capablanca will win this game. Sorry to give up the ending, but he plays with a 96.6% accuracy rating versus 91 by Richard Reti. And Capablanca had three great moves, only three inaccuracies versus his opponent's four, with one mistake and one miss. So let's see what happens in this game. Let me turn on the analysis, and Capablanca begins with e4. And this game takes place in New York in 1924, so 100 years ago. It's interesting to see how maybe the playing styles could have been a little bit different back then, especially with computers now that can come up with crazy moves. So Capablanca has played e4. Richard Reti plays e6, the French defense. And now we have d4 taking control of the center with both pawns. But in the French defense, you push to d5, and Capablanca responds by developing his knight. So now we have a knight developed by Reti attacking this pawn. And so the knight is pinned here, preventing this attack on the knight, or stopping it, slowing it down. All right, the pin is broken, and now the pawn pushes forward, gaining space in the center, locking up these pawns, and the knight must retreat. So after the knight retreat, we swap off the bishops. So Capablanca has succeeded in getting rid of his bad bishop, which was on the same color squares as his central pawns, and he swaps it off for his opponent's good bishop. All right. But it does help this queen develop. And so now Capablanca develops his queen as well. And then we have castling, and Capablanca does not castle on the opposite side. That can usually lead to some crazy games, because when you have opposite side castling, you can use a pawn storm. So if Capablanca would have castled over here, he could have just started throwing his pawns forward, and maybe he plans to do that. Because he's already pushed this f pawn, and this helps fortify the central e5 pawn, which could come under attack by his opponent's f pawn. So this is a common theme played in the French defense, where you have the pawns on d4 and e5, and the center's kind of locked. Well, you want to push the c pawn and attack the base of the pawn chain here. So, another reason to push this f pawn, because if this pawn disappears, well, then the f pawn will have to protect this e pawn. So, just developing by Capablanca, he brings his other knight up, and the same with Reti. So the game continues with a capture here, which will allow this knight to recapture and jump forward. And so now here, an interesting move, Capablanca just develops his bishop. Maybe enticing this knight to try and capture. So what happens? That's ignored. The top of the pawn chain is being attacked. So we have a capture by the queen. So now this battery of rook and queen are attacking this pawn here, and only the queen is defending. So we have g3, fortifying the f pawn, and the bishop develops here. Now the computer says this is an inaccuracy. So, why is this inaccuracy? The computer likes d4 better, which would attack this knight. And then where does the knight go? Maybe it jumps forward and attacks the queen. But with that inaccuracy, let's see how the game continues. Capablanca does castle kingside, although the computer recommends castling queenside. So he may have avoided opposite side castling because the knights are already over here. These pawns can start storming up the board and giving Richard Reti some counterplay if Capablanca would have castled over here. So the game continues with capture of the bishop, leaving Capablanca with an isolated pawn because he decides to capture with the pawn and not his queen. So that has left him with an isolated pawn that could potentially be weak in the endgame, but he's captured towards the center, and it helps fortify this e4 square. So, if this d pawn attacks the knight can jump forward and be protected pretty good by this d3 pawn here. All right, so a retreat by the bishop, maybe repositioning here to g6 and eyeing the pawn. The rook moves to the open, half open file, targeting this backward pawn. And the game continues with bishop to g6, putting some pressure on this pawn, although it's protected by the queen at the moment. Capablanca responds by jumping his knight up into his opponent's territory on the queen side. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, that king to g2 might have been better. So I don't know. We'll see why he's doing this. Perhaps he's going to jump back here and maybe pile up with, jump back here. No, he can't do that at the moment because the queen and the knight both are covering this. So I don't know. Maybe he could jump up here and then go after this. Let's see what his plan is. So Richard Reti pushes this pawn, getting rid of the backward pawn. And now we have knight to c3. So this must be the reason Capablanca moved up there, to reposition the knight back and now attack this unprotected pawn. So perhaps Capablanca had foreseen that this backward pawn would be pushed forward and it would leave this one weak. So now this pawn pushes forward and we're left with this e-pawn being backwards again. So an attack on the queen, bishop captures, and now rook captures. So this rook capture is the best move because if the pawn captures here, then you can move over, attack the queen, and force that queen to move. So let's see what happens here. Capture, rook captures, and now the queen has to retreat, slide over to the side, and looks like best would have been to go ahead and capture the rook here. But Capablanca takes time to develop his other rook, which was doing nothing over here in the corner. So capture, queen captures. So we just trade off into an endgame with knight and rook. So let's take a look at this. Apparently the pawns are even here on the queen side. Black has a little more space here with these isolated pawns on the d file. And Capablanca has two isolated pawns here, which could be potential weaknesses. So the king moves into the game, which is a smart thing to do in the end game. You want to activate your king, especially when you only have two pieces on your side of the board. You know, each side only has a knight and a rook, so you definitely want to get your king in there to help with attack and defense, depending on what your opponent does. And so here, the computer says that Richard Reti should have immediately jumped down here, forking the A pawn and the D3 pawn. But, you know, perhaps he didn't want to go into that because then Capablanca could capture this pawn. And now we have rook to e3, adding pressure to this isolated d4 pawn. So the rook, instead of protecting here, jumps over, and let's see what happens next. King moves forward, and if we go back, so why doesn't he capture here? Let's see if we can figure out. Probably didn't want both of these pawns working together. You know, whereas white is, his king is closer to this pawn, it would be easier to stop this. But if the rooks were exchanged and you have both of these pawns here, you know, that could cause a problem in the end game as these pawns try and push forward, and white would have this passed pawn on the e4 square. So instead, this move is played, I guess, to keep the knight from jumping forward, you know, potentially maybe getting ready to push the g pawn in the future. Now we have knight to e5. So what does this do? Well, it repositions the knight up on this outpost. If there's an exchange, well, then this pawn could recapture. Then white has the passed pawn advantage. So looks like capturing with the knight is best, though, which Reti does play that. Recapture with the pawn, because all pawn endgames with no pieces on the board can be pretty tricky. So Capablanca at least keeps the rooks on the board. Now the computer said it would have been fine to capture with the rook. So rook takes e5, and then, I don't know, we could take a look at what would happen if they exchange. What does it say? Well, if there's a complete exchange, here, white would be pretty much winning with this passed pawn up here. This king could move up here and pick this off and protect his pawn at the same time. Then he would have two passed pawns in the center. Black could perhaps start pushing these pawns, but I don't know, the king could, you know, go over here and stop this, especially if he pushes this pawn to help slow them down. All right, so back to the game. We had a knight exchange, this passed pawn on the e-file backed up by the rook on e4, and then the king moves forward. So computer likes the immediate push of this passed, well, not quite passed, but unopposed pawn in this pawn majority of 2 versus 1. So the rook moves over to protect here, and now we have rook to g4. So sliding over, you know, perhaps if this pawn pushes forward, the h pawn can push up, and, you know, this pawn majority would have been slowed down and stopped. So we have this g pawn moving up. So now the pawn does push forward to h4, threatening to capture, then recapture, then the rook could capture. So the king jumps in here to help protect this pawn. And apparently that's a mistake. That king to e6 should have been played. And then we have capture, and H5 would be best. Oh, now the computer changed its mind. This is a finicky computer, stockfish. I don't know. I mean, I guess uh, it must be programmed to only think for so many seconds. So it only goes so deep. And then once you make another move, it recalculates and then it finds different options. So now it's saying instead they should have captured. Then of course you would capture, and now we have what? King to d5. King up to d5 to protect this pawn. Oh, come on. What is going on with this computer? Now it just changed its mind again. Well, we already know what's going on. Like once it calculates a line and then you go a little bit deeper, then it recalculates. So what did it say was best? Rook over to h8. Anyway, before I go into all this crazy line, let's see what happened at the end of the game here. So we have h4. The king moved over to help protect. He didn't want to go into this line. So capture, capture, and now king moves up to e4. So an attack on the rook. Rook retreats back, and the king moves up, probably thinking, well, I'm going to help march my pawn forward. So Capablanca starts pushing his unopposed pawn. And then this pawn starts marching. But after e7, Richard Reti resigns here. So this was the best move in the game. At this point, the computer says that white is winning by +3 here. What do you play? Rook to e8 appears to be best. We could play this out a little bit further and see what happens. Rook to g8 might be another option, but it's not looking too good here. Let's see. We'll play what it says is best. Rook to e8. Now it's recalculating. Okay, it still likes that move. King to f5 or f4, and you threaten a mate. So let's do that and see what it says. Nope, inaccuracy. So king up to f5. You're threatening to capture the pawn. Capture. Capture with check. And now king to h3. And oh man, this computer just really likes to change its mind. Okay, computer, come on. Back to here then. The problem is you're going to have a threat of a mate. I mean, you could just pick this off. So we see, well, you can be behind a pawn in the endgame, but this king is so, a rook endgame, but this king is so trapped here on the edge. They recommend just capturing the pawn. And then, what? Rook to g7. Rook to e4. Then you can start marching this pawn up. But you get the idea. This passed pawn is going to start marching. The king is trapped on the edge of the board. We could go a little bit further. Computer recommends rook to g5. And now king up to f6 to get ready to help escort the pawn. And it even likes a move over to here as well to maybe go after these pawns. So rook to g6. Now it's saying king back to f5. Rook to g5. Why don't we go over there? All right, and now what? King up to e7. But you get the idea. This you can start helping this pawn move forward. I don't know. We can go there. Now we'll trade off rooks if he tries a check again. So rook over to a6. All right, now it's saying h6. Too late, computer, too late. Would play a4, rook to a5 check. King can move up. Rook to a6. King over to c7. Now you're targeting these pawns. Maybe you protect. And then rook to e5 check. King starts coming down. And I don't know, if you want to, you can just start pushing this pawn. Or you could even go over here and attack. But I don't know, the king could... It says that is best. Then I don't know, what if you try that? Now b4. So yeah, it's just looking bad here. You'll chase this rook away, and then you could pick this off. The king's trapped over here. All right, I'll end it there. Please like and subscribe for those that haven't already. Feel free to leave comments with any requests, suggestions. If there's something you'd like to see, leave any comments you would like. Also, thank you for watching and have a super chess day.